The slides will be available, and there is a CPE credit available, so you'll be able to submit that once we've sent you the certificate of attendance. If you can keep your questions and answers relevant to the content. I know it's always a good chance to ask us about general configuration questions, but if we can try and keep it on topic today, that'd be great. Safe harbor clause, I might be mentioning sometimes by accident, things coming down the product pipeline and things we're working on. It's really not a commitment, it's really just a roadmap. It's not a promise. So things can change, priorities can change. So just don't hold us to anything that I might be talking about as a future technology. Question, what is it that attackers want? They want access to your data. Why? Well, some of the cases we've seen recently, they want to steal your research to build a better submarine, or maybe they want to start a car industry in their company. Maybe they want to steal all of the information you have about your customers, their credit cards, their names, their email addresses, so they can sell them for $1 an item on the internet. Or maybe they just want to zip it all up, encrypt it, charge you a big fat ransom. And we've seen the GanCrab group supposedly retired after making about $2 billion just from ransomware. I think I must be in the wrong industry. We've seen the ransomware attack methodology pivot now to the point where they're not just doing a spray and pray, ransoming up the first machines they come across and charging $500. No, they are now using the same techniques, the advanced persistent threat techniques that we've seen in the top two reasons there, to get to the real data, your critical data, the stuff you can't live without and work without, and ransom that instead and charge much bigger fees. So that's what they want. How do they do it? Well, as our illustrious, one of our leaders says, I'll just send you an email promising you a free Snickers bar and you'll click the link. We only need that to happen once in an organization and you are pretty much owned after that. And every attack I've seen this year has started with an email. There's been a few where we've seen some vulnerabilities within remote desktop exposed as well, or stolen credentials, but this is typically the most common way. Now this is pretty simplistic. You might not fall for this one. Maybe you're a Netflix customer. Maybe you've flown on Qantas. Maybe you've been speeding. Maybe you've used Australia Post. Lots of different ways the attackers will structure their initial attack. But the more realistic they can make it, the more likely your users are to click on a link. What we're seeing now is that once one person clicks on it, the malware tends to be able to scan through your emails and send out more. So the people that receive it really do think it's a response to something they've sent before. So a little statement here, perfect is the enemy of good. So we're in the game of risk reduction. Anyone who thinks they're in the game of risk elimination is kidding themselves. And the more you try and eliminate all risk from your business, then the longer you're going to spend trying and finding out that it's not possible. So the goal of today's webinar is to try and get to a point where you're making it super difficult for the attackers. But at the same time, you can still do business without spending a whole lot of time on it. If we look at an attack lifecycle, this is the Cylance perspective. There's other of the kill chains that you might see out there, but typically we see the initial compromise starting with that phishing email, either with custom malware or just a macro-based document. They might use vulnerabilities as well. They then want to establish a foothold. It could be some sort of custom malware, but typically it's just something that they'll buy off the shelf or use off the shelf like MITRE ATT&CK or Cobalt Strike, or even ones we use internally for testing like Trevor C2. After that, it's about escalating privileges. So cracking passwords, Kerber roasting, and other ways of trying to move around and get some sort of privilege or looking around. And then once we've got those credentials, it allows us to move around the internal network a lot easier. Finally, the mission to completion usually involves either data theft or possibly ransoming, whatever is required. Now, the nice thing about a life cycle, and you can see it's quite a long chain, a lot of steps involved, we don't need to try and stop everything that's here. As long as we can stop a fair chunk of it and make it difficult, we're going to have the advantage that way. MITRE people come up with the attack framework, which kind of maps all the different techniques that they've observed from all the advanced persistent threat actors over history. And so we see how this sort of maps to our life cycle, where you've got the initial access and the privilege escalation and lateral movement and then the exfiltration. And there's a lot of different things that all these things are just built into your computer. They're just using tools that are already there available for them. If we take a look at a recent example, now I wrote about this internally back in July. I probably should have been a bit more vocal about it, but certainly the MITRE ATT&CK bot to RYOK attack has been a big one. It starts with that phishing email. There's a macro in a Word document. It launches PowerShell. PowerShell downloads the first virus, which is MITRE ATT&CK. MITRE ATT&CK downloads TrickBot. TrickBot then performs command and control. It might also download Cobalt Strike. They find your data, disable your antivirus services, delete your backups, and deploy the ransomware. The fee then jumps from your standard $500 to somewhere north of $500,000. And again, you can see it's a long process, a long kill chain. I only need to stop one of these things from working and the whole thing would fail. Now, if I map that process to the MITRE framework, you can see here spear phishing attachments, PowerShell, scripting, scheduled tasks, exploitation, disabling security tools, and so on. So all those red areas there are some of the techniques that we used and how they map to the MITRE framework. And when you do this, you can kind of see that a lot of these things can be blocked all the way through. They're kind of tripping over these mines, if you like. So the analogy then becomes, if anyone's ever played this Minesweeper back in the day. And so my inspiration for this actual talk today was from the Attack IQ people that do MITRE ATT&CK framework testing. And they essentially came up with the same idea that you don't need to protect your entire screen here with mines. If you can lay enough around and still allow business to work around them, they'll eventually trip over one or two or three of these and you'll lose the game. The attackers won't win. Now, if we step up the education 102, there's various ways to attack an operating system through code, through identity, and through denial of service. Now, if we look at code, we're looking at malware, we're looking at exploits, we're looking at scripts, and we're also looking at admin tools. And admin tools work a whole lot better if I've also got your identity. So that's what we'll focus on for the rest of the presentation, is the code and the identity area. For denial of service, that could be a distributed denial of service or something that's designed to kind of overload your internet connection or swamp your systems. So that's a different kind of protection mechanism we'd need for that. So within CylancePROTECT, if we're looking at specifically malware, as in Attack 102 Step 1, we have the auto quarantine with execution control feature. So we recommend trying to get that enabled as quickly as possible across the organization. There's only the two checkboxes, so we have the unsafe and the abnormal. It's a real, it's more to do with how confident the machine learning is, but I recommend to treat them both the same. Don't just turn on one and leave the other off. I recommend to always have them both on. So that will auto quarantine and deal with anything that we recognize as malware. In the next side, from 102, we had exploits. And so this is effectively code taking advantage of a bug or a vulnerability to try and achieve something. So within our memory protection area, we have coverage for this. We look at the exploitation techniques rather than looking for the signatures of exploit code. So this kind of gives us an ability to provide a signatureless IPS or virtual patching type solution. Now you can see here, I haven't got everything set to terminate. I've only got most of them set to block. And the reason I do this is because the way that this works, if you've got a Windows vulnerability that has the exploit and the attacker takes advantage of that, we would terminate Windows, resulting in a blue screen. Now that typically upsets the users, and if we don't need to do that, then why do it? The only one there that I set to terminate is the LSAS read, because nothing good at doing an LSAS read. It's trying to get your credentials from memory and dump them out into clear text. So we'll leave that one on terminate. But otherwise, everything's good to go for block. And we have some pretty common exclusions that we'd normally set up for this one. The WER fault is the Windows Error Reporting fault tool. So if you have a blue screen of death, it kind of collects a bunch of information about your system to send to Microsoft. The SDCLT is the shadow copy client. So again, we want that one to be running. Now, yes, attackers could use one of those exclusions to launch an attack. But again, the risks are pretty small. Don't go for perfection. If you turn them off and exclude them, that's fine. Even if you didn't exclude them, you probably wouldn't pick it up from all the noise that WordFault generates anyway. What about scripts? I'm a big fan here. We have within our tool that we block active script being VB script and JScript. Now, yes, it's a pretty binary mechanism. The idea is to only allow authorized scripts to run. But how many of you need to allow macros to run on servers? Very, very few. It's a real exception area. What about running PowerShell on end user devices? Do they really need that access? And if we look at the attacks, most of them have been a macro that pivots to PowerShell. So as long as one of those two mechanisms is blocked on every system in your organization, that first stage of the attack won't work. It can be as simple as that. There's always going to be outliers in cases, and I'll show you in the demo how we deal with that, how we kind of enable this as much as we possibly can. So if you set this to block for desktops, alert for servers on the PowerShell, do vice the other way around for macros, it's typically a pretty good start. Common exclusions might be for SCCM, sysvol and netlogon. You might have some Citrix and you might have an actual folder where you run scripts from consistently, which is good, best practice. So assigning your scripts, if you follow all that type of behavior, then you're on your way. You've set some good landmines there. On the optics side, this is the Cylance EDR solution. So a little bit deeper in scripts because we can look at the intent of a script. We don't really look inside things like Java in terms of what's happening on the protect side, but certainly for optics, we have rules for Java remote access Trojans and Java payloads. We can look inside PowerShells and see what their intent is. So even if you do need to allow PowerShell in protect, we can still look at them in a little bit deeper with optics and still provide some coverage. For stealing credentials, we see from the MITRE framework, things like account discovery and credential dumping. We have the LSAS read as well and Kerberoast. Typically, these rules can be enabled without too much noise on most systems. And in terms of admin tools, we see things like AutoIT and PSExec and things like scheduled tasks and system service discovery. These are all standard admin tools. You don't necessarily need to set all of them to block, but certainly if you're alerting and you get a notification that someone's running a NS lookup on an endpoint system, why would that need to be the case? We could check that. Why is something creating a scheduled task? So these are some of the rules that we have within optics to cover this area. Let's bring it all together in a demo. I'll just run back through policy again, just so you can see where those first items were within the protect side. So within a policy, we typically start with memory protection enabled, but everything in alert mode. Same with the script control. We want everything in alert mode. This allows us to build up a bit of an inventory over time. And sometimes for memory actions, 2 or 3 days is enough. For script control, maybe it needs to be a week. But once we've got an inventory, we can then jump back into our devices area where I've got my default policy running. How many actual script control events and exploit attempts did I have? I can set this filter to 0 and say is equal to, and I can see here 411 of my systems have had no exploit attempts. Now I can filter this further based on the policy where I've had the alert running for a little while, but that means that all of these systems can now have the memory protection enabled without any impact on the end users. For script control, same kind of thing. We can have a look in here. How many zeros have we got? 516. So again, a lot of these ones can now have the script control enabled, carte blanche without really any impacts, provided that they've been in an alerting mode for a little while. Where I have systems that don't have a 0, we can jump back in and have a bit of a closer look. And I can see here, this is an actual macro script running from an XLSM document. Now for that, I wouldn't go whitelisting it because that one actually does look like it could potentially be hostile. But we could go and find out what is this book1.xlsm from the user, just running from their documents folder. It could just be an innocuous macro. but we'd want to check it just to be sure. And typically when we run through this process, you end up at something like a 98% of your fleet you can run without too much checking. And then for the last ones, again, if it's a problem, have a look at them. But we're going for good, we're not going for perfect. So if you need to allow a few devices with macros, let them go. Now there's also in the protection area, we can review all the scripts at once, JScript and VB script, which will use the active script interpreter. And again, based on filtering, I can work out whether I have any that are a problem or not. So if I have no active script in my environment, then do I really need to allow it at all? Maybe I can turn that one off. If I have no PowerShell, we can turn that one off as well. So again, ways of searching, going for good and blocking as much as possible. Let's have a look at optics. This is where it can get quite noisy. You need some strategies around dealing with what's coming into the console. So the way that I work with optics, we have these detection rules, and let me fire these up here. I've gone through 3 different sets of things that we can look at. And sometimes it's better to just turn on handfuls of these at a time before they get too out of control. So we set them to on, leave the notifications off because otherwise it will alert the users, and we'll see if anything triggers. Some of these can be incredibly noisy. Some of the Microsoft Office-based ones, some of the installation ones, things that trip when Windows updates runs, can all be quite noisy. So there's a couple of ways to deal with them, and I'll cover that. I mean, one of them is just turning the rule back off. You don't need to have our entire detection rule set enabled to get coverage. We just want to set those landmines. Make sure we've got enough left on that we can detect anything bad, but turn off the ones that get in the way of business. So as we enable them, we're bringing in these detections here. And I typically just like to focus on normally the last 24 hours, or if you've just turned it on, you can leave it at a week. But what we're looking for as we go through the list here, just briefly, I can see I've got some SIP and trust provider hijacking, in fact, quite a lot. MSI exec, so I know what I've been doing today. I was running a bunch of Windows updates on this system, and it was tripping over this rule quite a lot. Now, there's some things we can do here. One of the things we can do is create an exception. And when we do that, we're given some criteria we can use. So I can use the MSI exec process, and I can also look at what it's actually targeting in terms of, say, the MS Core, this MS Core DLL. This one's going to be pretty random, I think, though. So it might be a little tricky to actually create an exception from this one because I think it's going to be quite variable in what it's updating. I don't want to exclude MSI exec in general, though. Potentially for this one, it might be easy enough to turn off the SIP and trust provider hijacking rule in the detections. We can mark them as a false positive here. So you can see I've got 75 items that are similar to the initial one that I've looked at. So when we look at duplicates, I see all these similar ones here. And if I use the mark all selected detections as false positives and delete and save, that clears them all out of optics really quickly. So now I'm looking now at what's left over. And so what we have left over might be things around macros and Office documents. So this is an Excel, but this Excel is pivoting to PowerShell. So this one would be worth following up. And I know that this is a malicious one, but I haven't seen a whole lot of these Office DD script interpreters in the rules here. So I'd probably leave this one enabled and treat them as I see them. So that'd be my strategy typically. And you can start with looking at just profile ones, then the mediums and then the lows if needed. The informationals are really just there so that they can put something into your seam for later reference and cross-referencing. And you can create rules that will indicate usage of network drives and other types of things. Just simple commands that users might run from time to time as well, like changing their screensaver. So it's still good to have them recorded, but you don't necessarily need to have them as a high priority action item in here. So my strategy for optics would be then, just if I summarize, turn on sections of rules at a time, use the exclusions and the false positive rules to clear out detections if they start getting quite noisy, enable a few more, If you're finding that there's no common way to create an exception, turn them back off again. You should still end up with a large amount of detection rules enabled. And then once you're comfortable, then we can start getting a bit more aggressive and turning on some of the. And so something like a Java remote access Trojan, it's going to be very unlikely that that will trip anything legitimately in your business. And then we have responses like terminating the process tree for this one. And so now we start making it really difficult to run certain types of attacks, PowerShell downloads, scripts connecting to internet addresses, hidden PowerShell execution, all these standard things that we can generally turn on pretty easily without impacting the business at all, but making it really difficult for the attackers. Now, we do have a support article that talks about our recommended responses for the rules, and I'll include a link to that in the presentation when it's made available to you. And if you really want to go next level, we do have our playbooks feature, which then can perform things like automated forensic data collection. If I shut that down, but at the same time, if I can collect the user's browser history, master file tables or application history, and have that sent off to a remote location, I can make sure that maybe it was something as innocent as a user's visited a bad website and downloaded something or clicked a link in an email. I've also got the focus view option within Optics to review the detections as well. So that's the end of the presentation part of the content. So we keep it nice and simple and short. I believe there should be some questions that have come through. If you have any more questions, there is a Q&A section within the Zoom tool that you can ask questions in. So the first question we have is the severity something we can set, or is it set by default? So the existing detection rules are set by us, but you do have the ability to create your own detection rules. So if I look at a detection rule itself, we have the clone option. And from here, I can choose what severity to make it. And I can also modify some of the JSON code there to do what I need it to do. So we do have a guide on how to build custom rules, or you can create your own simply by cloning and modifying some of the existing ones if it's close to what you wanted to do already. If you've got a fairly complex requirement, we can help you out with that as well. Okay, I've spotted a question in the chat window, so let me cover this one off. There's a question around the new 2.4 sensors. So I better cover those off. That is a big topic. So with 2.4, we have new sensors available for optics as well. So we've added the ability to look at DNS requests, private networking as well now. So we were previously looking at connections to public IP addresses. Now we include private ones, so we can look at east-west movement. We offer the ability to look inside Windows event logs, PowerShell, WMI, more enhanced portable execution parsing, and also process and hooking visibility. Now all these new sensors are available for Windows 10 operating systems. So Windows 7 or Windows 8 and below will still use the existing sensors that we had before. So the new sensors allow us to provide much more information in the focus view, and also allow us to use the InstaQuery for more detailed threat hunting. So if you've detected a macro that's tried to connect to a website, maybe that free Snickers bar one, you could do a InstaQuery lookup across your fleet to see if there was any other one that's looked up that same URL. All right, well, if there's no other questions, I'll wrap this up, give you some time back in your day. As I mentioned, it was recorded. The presentation will be available. I'm happy to let you use that as a reference. I think it's an important education piece. So as a follow-up, you should all receive a follow-up email for this, provided you registered as well. There's a question around compatibility with VDI. It's just something that our QA team haven't really focused on yet. So CylanceOPTICS will install in a VDI environment, but we haven't QA'd it. So at this stage, there's a lot of different VDI environments and structures out there, and we'll certainly get around to ensuring that it's supported pretty soon. So this is the first webinar I've done with the new look UI. And so as what's coming down the pipeline now that we've done this, you should see new role-based access control, custom role feature. And we've certainly got some more exciting things rolling out over the next few months as well. So I believe there's some improvements to script control, memory defense, zoning and tagging and grouping devices. So yeah, keep watching out for all of that. All right, so if there's no further questions, the link in the chat window. So please let us know how you think it went today, if the quality was all right, and if there's any content you'd like to see in the future, we can also help out with that as well. So we'll probably rerun our webinar around the top 10 reasons why it's time to review your endpoint, which is probably more focusing around legacy AV users at that stage. So one question around what's the top malware in the whole world? Would you believe right now it's still WannaCry at 60%? I think that was a statistic that I saw recently. And it keeps coming back, because if you're a signature-based antivirus, you can't have the signatures for everything forever, because you'd run out of space. So they keep dropping the signature for WannaCry, and it keeps getting repackaged and redistributed, which is surprising, but yeah, we still see a lot out there. All right, well, thanks for attending today.